What if the secret to endless clean energy was not locked inside a futuristic lab or guarded in the vaults of billion-dollar companies, but quietly decomposing in a forest, hidden in piles of rotting wood? What if the blueprint for independence, for warmth, for power without pollution was already discovered by a man whose name most of us have never heard? This is not a fantasy of machines humming in space or reactors glowing with exotic metals. This is a story of biology, of patience, and of one man who dared to ask why decay itself could not be the fuel of life. In the 1970s, deep the rugged hills of southern France, Jean Pain stumbled upon something that seemed impossible. He was not a scientist nor a wealthy inventor. He was a forester, living simply with his wife, managing hundreds of acres with little more than stubborn determination. He had no laboratories, no engineers, and no corporations backing him. Yet he built a power plant in the woods, silent and alive, that ran on nothing but compost. It began with a pile of brushwood. Jean had cut and chipped the excess wood not for firewood, but simply as a way of storing it. Days later, the pile was strangely hot, not just warm from the sun, but hot enough to radiate heat through the cool air of the forest. There was no flame, no engine, no electrical connection. It seemed to burn without burning. Curious, Jean observed, experimented, and repeated the process. Each time he soaked the brushwood and left it to rot, the pile heated again. He realized this was not magic but biology. Microbes were devouring the wood in a natural process called aerobic decomposition, breaking down organic matter and releasing energy. The warmth was simply the byproduct of life feeding on death. But to Jean, it was more than a curiosity, it was power. What if this natural heat could be harnessed, controlled, directed? What if a forest could power not just itself, but a home, a farm, or even a life lived in complete independence from oil and coal? Jean had no investors waiting for results. He was a man of the land, surviving on ingenuity and hard work. But within those piles of rotting wood, he saw the possibility of energy without pollution, fertility without chemicals, and freedom without dependence on governments or corporations. Necessity pushed him to experiment further. Unable to afford straw bedding for his goats, he used chipped brushwood instead. The goats thrived. Their waste mixed with wood chips became compost that transformed his poor, sandy soil into rich, fertile earth. Soon his vegetable gardens were overflowing. Tomatoes climbed taller than his shoulders. Watermelons swelled to impossible sizes. Even tropical crops like chayote flourished in land that once seemed barren and dry. The compost held water, nourished roots, and turned dust into life. Jane had tapped into a cycle that gave back more than it took, but fate offered him even more material. When new French wildfire prevention laws required brush to be cleared for safety, Jeanne suddenly had mountains of excess wood. Most foresters would have burned it or hauled it away. Jean saw fuel waiting to be unlocked. He began building what would become his greatest invention, a living machine known as the biomiler or compost-powered reactor. At first, it was crude, little more than a heap of chipped wood, but Jean learned that shape mattered. A dense circular mound trapped heat better, accelerated decomposition, and kept the process alive longer. Inside, he coiled hundreds of feet of polyethylene pipe through which he pumped cold groundwater. By the time the water emerged, it had been heated to nearly 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Day and night, regardless of weather, the system delivered consistent hot water. For months, even for over a year, the pile radiated heat. Jean was able to heat his home, bathe in hot water, and survive cold winters without ever burning a single log. But he was not finished. At the center of the pile, he buried a sealed steel tank filled with water-soaked wood chips. As the wood decayed without oxygen, it released methane gas. Jean captured it in old truck inner tubes and metal cylinders. That gas became his cooking fuel. his oven fuel, even the power source for a small generator. With careful storage and compression, he fueled his car, driving for miles on clean, renewable gas that came not from oil wells, but from rotting brushwood. From one invention, Gene had built an entire system. It heated his house, it cooked his meals, it powered his lights, it ran his vehicle. And when the energy finally dwindled, the remains of the pile were not waste, but treasure. Dark, rich compost ready to restore his soil, growing food that fed him and his goats, beginning the cycle all over again. Gene had created a closed-loop system, a cycle of life that produced energy, food, and safety while returning everything to the earth in better condition than it was found. This was not just sustainability. This was regeneration. It was a blueprint for living beyond the reach of oil companies, power plants, and government subsidies. For a while, the world noticed. Journalists visited his land to see the biomiler in action. Reader's Digest published a story on him in 1981, reaching millions. His book sold over 100,000 copies. Scientists and energy experts from around the world praised his system. Some even called it the future of energy and fertilizer. And yet, it all faded. Gene's work was not flawed. It worked, and it worked beautifully. It was clean, reliable, and endlessly renewable. But it was not easy. It required space, ideally acres of forest. It required time, tools, patience, and constant involvement. It was not as simple as flipping a switch. It could not be mass-produced and sold in stores like solar panels or wind turbines. Governments did not see profit in it. Corporations had no factories to build, no billion-dollar industry to control. Gene's model was small, local, and circular, built on independence and effort. The world was moving fast in the opposite direction, toward centralized grids, mass production, and convenience. And so, despite its brilliance, Gene's system was left behind. But history has a way of circling back. Today, as energy costs rise, as wildfires rage hotter, as fertilizer prices climb and soil collapses under chemical abuse, Gene's ideas appear startlingly relevant. Imagine heating your home without fossil fuels. Imagine growing food in barren land without irrigation or chemical fertilizer. Imagine driving a car fueled not by oil companies, but by your own compost heap. Gene built all of this half a century ago with nothing but determination and piles of brushwood. His machine did not pollute. It did not extract rare minerals. It did not leave behind toxic waste. It gave more than it took. It was energy, food, and safety wrapped into one humble cycle of life. What Gene created was not just a machine, it was a philosophy, a reminder that the earth already provides everything if we learn to listen. Every stage of his system served multiple purposes. The wood chips produced heat, then methane, then compost. The methane cooked meals, powered lights, and fueled a car, leaving no toxic residue. The compost enriched the soil, grew food, and restored the forest. Even the act of clearing brush reduced wildfire risk, protecting the land and communities nearby. Nothing wasted, nothing polluted, everything connected. It was the circular economy we speak of today, fully realized decades before the term was popular, and yet it was born not from a laboratory, but from one man's observation of rotting wood. Gene's legacy is not a machine waiting to be commercialized. It is a challenge, a question posed quietly to each of us. What could you build if you trusted patience over profit? What freedom could you achieve if you relied on the gifts of nature instead of the chains of industry? Gene's biomiler stands as a reminder that true innovation may not come from billion-dollar breakthroughs. It may come from compost piles, from decay, from systems that quietly give more than they take. In a time when the world is scrambling for solutions to climate change, energy shortages, and soil depletion, perhaps the forgotten power of compost is not just quaint history. Perhaps it is the future we ignored. And perhaps the real question is this: What would you build if all you had was time, determination, and wood?